Hey, I'm Mark. Let's go. Summer school. We got stuff to do before you go up to the lake. Today, let's put another movie in its historical context. Why? Because I'm a history teacher and I'm going rogue. Hey, speaking of going rogue, many of you have seen my historical analysis of the BBC film Threads from 1984. One person that watched my video commented, I Googled it, saw it got a 92% on Metacritic, and delightedly informed my boyfriend that we should watch it. Biggest of regrets. Yeah, that's definitely going to spoil the mood for you and your boyfriend. For about a week, I'm sure. Don't say I didn't warn you. In this period, we're going to look at the precursor to Threads. Let's analyze the BBC movie The War Game from 1966. And let's put it into its historical context. Let's go rogue. Before we go on, though, I'm going to need to get from you your parent permission slips. And for those of you who don't have your parent permission slips, we have some nice nuclear holocaust coloring books up in the library. All right. So in 1965, the British Broadcasting Corporation green-lighted a project produced, written, and directed by Peter Watkins, a docudrama about the effects of nuclear war called The War Game. The final product caused consternation within the BBC and the British government, and the project was shelved. The BBC saying that the effect of the film was too horrifying for the medium of broadcasting. Borrowing from the experiences of German civilians during the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg, and Japanese accounts of the firebombing of Tokyo and the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the film gives an intensely detailed description of a fictitious bombing of Kent, England, and its aftermath. The film is a mashup of documentary and drama, with the actors speaking directly to the camera in some sequences while ignoring the camera in the more dramatic segments. The plot is not carried by any one character or any group of characters. The story shifts from one element of a nuclear attack to another. Spliced into the drama are brief contemporary interviews in which passers-by on the street show a general ignorance about the effects of nuclear war, and interviews with public figures that play down the harshest of realities concerning nuclear war. As producer Peter Watkins said, interwoven among scenes of reality were stylized interviews with a series of establishment figures, an Anglican bishop, a nuclear strategist, etc. The outrageous statements by some of these people, including the bishop, in favor of nuclear weapons, even nuclear war, were actually based on genuine quotations. Other interviews with a doctor, a psychiatrist, etc., were more sober and gave details of the effects of nuclear weapons on the human body and mind. In this film, I was interested in breaking the illusion of media-produced reality. My question was, where is reality? The war in The War Game begins with the Chinese invasion of South Vietnam on behalf of the Communist North. The United States counters with tactical nuclear weapons against the Chinese. When the Soviets and East Germans invade West Berlin, the United States authorizes its NATO commanders to use tactical nuclear weapons. In response, the Soviets fire intermediate-range ballistic missiles against targets in Britain. The film notes that this escalation occurs so quickly because the Soviets are using liquid-fueled missiles that had to be fired from above ground and were in danger of being taken out quickly. One missile overshoots a Royal Air Force base and strikes a city in Kent. One of the more significant scenes is the firestorm created by the bomb over Kent. Taking eyewitness accounts again from the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg and Tokyo 2 decades earlier, Watkins notes the temperature within the firestorm itself reaching 800 degrees, the rapidly rising air creating winds of up to 100 miles an hour, sucking everything into the flames. Trees, cars, the firemen sent out to fight the flames, and the oxygen supply being sapped as victims on screen collapse from asphyxiation from carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. The rest of the film focuses on the social breakdown afterward. The government becomes authoritarian as it tries to maintain control. The huge number of dead can't be buried, so the authorities simply burn the bodies. Doctors are overwhelmed. The most seriously injured are left to die if they don't ask to be killed. The authorities simply comply. Children stare blankly into the camera, their arms and chests masses of scar tissue. Those that have escaped injury go into a state of shock from the things that they've seen. The police shoot at a crowd arriving for food. A mob overturns a munitions truck, taking its weapons, and breaks into a food depot, killing the policeman. The camera examines a woman who stands over the body of a dead policeman, her arms filled with loot. The narrator explains, "This is Joyce Fisher. She was a housewife." 2 men are executed for obstructing a government official. A minister leads them in the Lord's Prayer before they're shot. On earth as it is in heaven. The film ends with an interview with children in a refugee camp that were orphaned by the attack. They stare blankly into the camera, and as the interviewer asks them what they want to do when they grow up, each of them replies, "I don't want to do nothing." There's a church service on Christmas Day, and the film ends with the singing of Silent Night. And roll credits. Although it was withdrawn from BBC audiences, the film ran for 3 weeks in 1966 at the National Film Theatre in London. Then was shown abroad at a number of international film festivals, winning a special prize in Venice, Italy, winning a 1967 Academy Award for Best Documentary Film. That same year, it won the British Academy of Film and Television Arts Award for Best Short Film and the BAFTA United Nations Award. The BBC finally televised the film in Great Britain in 1985 for the 40th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, alongside a repeat broadcast of Threads. Well, that was a great double feature. Mental health professionals working overtime. Roger Ebert gave the film 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. He called it one of the most skillful documentary films ever made, praising the remarkable authenticity of the firestorm sequence and describing its portrayal of bombing's aftermath as certainly the most horrifying ever put to film. He suggested it should be shown on television, perhaps right after one of those half-witted war series in which none of the stars ever gets killed. The British Film Institute ranked The War Game number 27 on its list of 100 greatest British television programs, and Channel 4 voted it number 74 on its list of 100 scariest moments. So let's put The War Game into its historical context. That's 15% on the AP test. The film was released in 1966. Most of the production was done in 1965, the year after Columbia released Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove. We can easily connect this to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Being the United States' closest ally, a member of NATO, Britain was a major target for the Soviet Union if the Cold War turned hot. Certainly, English sphincters were puckered just as much as Americans were when the Soviet ships closed on the U.S. Navy's quarantine line in November of 1963. The Soviets were active in another area closer to Britain in the 1960s. This is the time frame in which the Soviets and the East Germans built the Berlin Wall. In fact, some of the footage from the War Game is from civilian protests against its construction. A decade before the Berlin Wall, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, keeping the Americans and the British from resupplying the city with food and fuel. The West resorted to supplying West Berlin via an airlift that lasted 11 months. West Berliners were saved. But were the Soviets to fire on one of those transport planes, another situation where the Cold War could have turned hot. Building the wall could have been seen as another aggressive action directed at the West. The internal politics of Britain are important as well. In an election in 1964, the Labour Party of Harold Wilson had run on a platform of disarmament. After the election, Wilson's government created a full-scale nuclear program. The British press was silent about the government's actions, and the populace had no idea what was going on, as shown in the film's interviews. Let's consider another thing. We've looked at The War Game and Threads, two BBC productions. We've looked at a number of American productions as well. The Day After, Failsafe, Dr. Strangelove, War Games. Is there a difference between how British productions differ from their American counterparts? One thing that sticks out to me is the grittiness of the British films. Both Threads and The War Game put the viewer on the ground, living the post-apocalyptic experience. The American films insulate the audience from the horror. Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove mainly take place inside of protected bunkers. War Games takes place inside Cheyenne Mountain, where NORAD Command is located. What does this say about the British experience compared to the American experience? The War Game was produced 25 years after the Blitz of London during World War II. Much of Britain's population that experienced the Blitz was still alive. War was nothing new to Britain. It was still in the nation's collective consciousness. Now, the general population of the United States hadn't experienced war since the 1860s, literally 100 years before. We don't know about the effects of war on the civilian population. We are insulated, like Dr. Strangelove and President Fonda and Ferris Bueller. In terms of geography, Britain sits in a much more precarious position than the United States. The War Game notes that civilians in Britain would have about 8 minutes after detecting a Soviet intermediate-range missile launch. About 5 minutes for a submarine-based ballistic missile launch. In the United States, civilians would have about 30 minutes to prepare for an ICBM. Time to get into a bunker with Strangelove and Fonda and Bueller. And how about time frames? What do you see in the 20 years between The War Game and Threads? At the beginning of The War Game, the narration explains how Britain still sees itself as a major power in the 1960s. Shoulder to shoulder with the US and toe-to-toe with the Soviets on the battlefield. By the 1980s, in Threads, the attack on Great Britain is almost collateral damage in a war that would be the United States versus the Soviet Union. Threads seems to regret Britain's alliance with NATO and the potential Holocaust that may have come with it. So there you go, The War Game. Have you seen it? Can you imagine the craziness that it may have created in England in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1964? Maybe the BBC was correct not to release the film. What do you think? I hope you had fun, and I hope you learned something. If I did it right, you did both. Hey, I had fun, Blanc quit my day job, and the next time you're in England and the authorities come by with a pamphlet on what to do, how to survive a nuclear attack, remember me. I'm Mark Haggard. I'm a history teacher, and I've gone rogue.